The morning sun slipped through the cracked windshield, scattering warm lines across a faded baseball cap on the passenger seat, and the smell of oil and old coffee rising from the upholstery felt oddly comforting. The street hummed with the slow, familiar rhythm of a neighborhood waking up, birds arguing with the garbage truck, the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt from last night. Jason Cruz, 38, single father and courier, was halfway through his second breakfast when a stuttering horn and the sound of metal scraping on concrete cut through the quiet. He turned, coffee mug in hand, and saw a compact car stalled under the sycamore, smoke wreathing the hood like a ragged halo. He did not think about the brand on the grill or the value of what sat inside. He thought of safety, and he thought of the small, warm body at home that depended on him. He ran across wet pavement, boots splashing, his breath a white punctuation in the cool air. The driver, a woman in a light jacket, had her hands pressed to her face, eyes raw and startled, hair damp with oil and rain. Her voice came out small and urgent. "Please, I think the starter is dead, and I have to get to the ranch." He glanced at his phone, at the clock that marked another run waiting, and then did what he always did without thinking. He opened the hood, felt heat and the snap of a loose cable, smelled burned insulation and rain, and in a few quick moves had the engine coughing back to life. She slid behind the wheel like someone anchoring herself. He wiped grease from his palms on his jeans and handed her a paper towel. "You good?" he asked. The answer that followed would not have fit on any map he carried. Who was she, and why did her name change everything he thought he knew about luck and kindness? Jason Cruz lived in an apartment above Rosa Alvarez's bakery, an 85-square-meter patch of second-hand furniture and trophies of small victories. He had been a kid who learned early to fix things with a bit of wire and a lot of stubbornness. His mother taught him the smell of cinnamon and how to count too many bills into a single hopeful handful. As a teenager, he apprenticed at a mechanic's shop, oil under his nails and ambitions tethered to steady paychecks. He met the mother of his daughter, Mia, in a ninth-grade class, and the relationship crumpled and reformed into co-parenting that left Jason with weekends of small triumphs and months of quiet worry. The middle years taught him the ledger of survival, deliveries that paid 1 month's rent, extra shifts that bought winter coats, and mornings spent rehearsing patience. People called him steady, persistent, a guy who would not walk past a person in need. That reputation had roots in the way his father had taught him to stand up for others, and the way his own son did not know how to write daddy without curling the D into a heart. This history bent toward the present. Every time Jason fixed a problem for someone else, he imagined the day when someone would glance at his tired hands and decide to help back. He tried not to base his life on that hope. He still held it like a small coin in his pocket. The incident under the sycamore felt, in truth, ordinary at first, and then impossible. Rain from last night had left puddles that reflected the sky, and the car's hood steamed like a kettle. The woman's name tag, half obscured by condensation, read Evelyn on the inside of her jacket. She kept saying, "Ranch, ranch," and fingers of anxiety tugged at her sleeve. Jason leaned in, lights of the storefronts pooling on the chrome, and asked the sorts of questions that cut to the practical heart of any roadside emergency. "Did you hit something?" he said. "Is anyone hurt?" "No, just stalled," she said. "I've been trying to start it for 20 minutes. I'm on my way to the Harrow place. They're expecting me." He looked at the GPS, the route name, the length of time a tow could cost. A piece of paper fluttered from her glove compartment, half a receipt, half something else, stamped with a logo he did not recognize. He worked his hands, fingers tracing wires and connections, the smell of burnt rubber sharp in his nose. Sparks popped once, like small startled insects, and then the engine coughed awake. She laughed, a raw sound that was closer to relief than joy. "You saved me," she said, voice dropping like a secret. The car lights painted Jason's face in sudden gold. He said, light and practical, "Just glad you're okay. You need a ride?" She hesitated, eyes on the dark road, then shook her head. "No, I can drive. Thank you. Really." He turned to leave, coffee cooling in his palm, unaware that what he had rescued was more than a person with a broken starter. He had, without knowing it, nudged a sequence of events that would stretch beyond a neighborhood and into offices, council rooms, and the small classroom where his daughter learned cursive. That same afternoon, the neighborhood chatter was a low current. Luis Ortega from the bodega told him someone saw a black SUV circling the block, and Officer Torres stopped by to ask if Jason had given his name. He shrugged it off with the calm of someone who had been praised for doing what was right and then asked to sign a form later. Evelyn Harrow, as Jason learned the next morning when a polite woman in a pressed coat came to the bakery with a bouquet and a check folded into the stems, was not just anyone. Her father was Tom Harrow, a rancher whose land stitched together more county maps than any simple farmer's field. The Harrows bred cattle that fetched prices people in town whispered about in the evenings. The woman who had been grateful at the Sycamore had the soft hands of someone who had learned to ride, but the posture of someone used to rooms with high ceilings and quiet doors. She introduced herself as Evelyn, voice steady, and then added something that made Rosa's eyes go wide. "My father wants to meet the man who stopped for me last night," she said. The word "stopped" felt like a rope across a canyon of possibilities. Jason's first thought was of Mia, of how he could explain to her that a wrong turn in a bad starter had led to bouquets and polite talk of meetings. He was careful in front of Evelyn, the way he had always been careful in front of money. There was a small, sharp unease in him, not from greed, but from a private rule. Kindness was not a bill to be settled. A day later, Evelyn returned, this time with a driver and documents. The Harrow name was on a business card heavy with embossed letters, and on a folder that smelled faintly of lemon oil. They met in front of Rose's bakery, where pastries steamed and a chorus of neighborhood voices kept watch. Jason was there because he had promised himself to be visible for Mia's school pickup, and because the town had a way of pulling its own into the center of sudden stories. The conversation began almost ceremonially. Evelyn leaned on a wooden bench and spoke with a quiet that could hold attention better than raised voices. "My father sent me to the city for a meeting, and my car stalled on County Road 7, she began. "You fixed it. We would like to thank you properly." Jason blinked, wiping his hands on his jeans like he always did, and said, "I'm fine. You don't have to do anything. I did what anyone would do." There followed the exchange that would later be played back on local news with different chords of tone. "Please," Evelyn said, "let us at least cover your expenses." He refused. "I do this because it's right," he told her. "It is not about money." There were 8 or 9 back and forths that afternoon. Neighbors leaning toward the bench, Rosa arranging extra napkins, Officer Torres watching with a polite distance. "We can show our appreciation," Evelyn said. "My father wants to make an offer." "I appreciate it," Jason answered, hands open and steady, "but this is not something I take payment for." "Then what would you accept?" she asked, sincerity in her voice. He hesitated. "A chance," he said finally, thinking of Mia's school fees and the leaks in the ceiling. She looked at him as if cataloging small facts. "Tell me about how you make a living," she said. He told her about deliveries, the mornings before sunrise, the nights turning wrenches, the hope that something steadier might come along. The conversation swelled, practical and personal, until it leaned into the moral spine of the matter. When does gratitude become charity, and when does charity become control? Pause here for a second, because this part matters to the community. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments which moment hit you most hard: the rescue, the refusal to accept money, or the surprising offer. Start your comment with one of these words to help us understand you: surprise, gratitude, or amazement. We read every reply, and sometimes those comments shape the next stories we tell. Now back to the moment when a private act met public consequence. Evelyn did not leave with a check tucked into a napkin. She returned to her SUV, and pages of conversation turned into an unexpected offer. Tom Harrow called later that week, his voice large but not unkind. "Jason," he said, "my daughter tells me about the man who stopped for her. I run a lot of operations that need honest men who know tools and work. Would you consider looking at some positions on our maintenance team?" Jason listened as the details unfurled, the formal language of employment edged with an offer that sounded both practical and improbable. "We have a small housing unit for staff," Tom said. "We can talk about relocation, schooling for your daughter, and a stable salary." It was specific enough to be real and big enough to feel unreal. The town buzzed. Sarah Green from the local paper called to ask for an interview. Mayor Daniels sent a brief congratulatory note about neighborly courage. Miguel Santos, Jason's supervisor, warned him gently about uprooting Mia from her school. Luis from the bodega offered to store his toolbox free of charge. Each voice knitted a web of choices that demanded an answer. Jason slept on it with the careful agitation of someone weighing responsibility. He thought of Mia's laugh, of the way she folded herself into the back seat when they drove to the park. He thought of the ceiling leak, of the teacher's note about a field trip he could not always afford. He also thought of his father's lesson, that dignity was not a currency to be bought. The offer posed a new question. Could accepting help preserve dignity in a way that refusing would not? The negotiation that followed was not a single dramatic public reveal, but a sequence of careful human conversations. Evelyn met him again in the small municipal hall, papers on a table between them, and the tenor shifted from gratitude to partnership. "We want to do this right," she said. "Not charity, a job, not a story, a responsibility." He probed hours, scope of work, schooling logistics for Mia, the contract, health benefits. "We have a fund for community housing, a small scholarship for children of staff, and a transportation allowance," she said. There were 10 exchanges in that room at least, while corridors hummed with unseen bureaucracy. "Will you be expected to be on call?" he asked. "Yes, but with limits," she said. "You will have 2 consecutive days off per week." "What about union agreements?" he asked. "We will respect them and write protections into the contract," she said. "And if you ever feel uncomfortable with anything, you can speak to our liaison, Rosa Alvarez, or to Miguel Santos, who will be your point on site." The names dropped into the negotiation like anchors. He left with a copy of a draft and the odd sensation that kindness and business could be braided without losing their edges. The story did not stay private for long. Sarah Green ran a piece that was careful not to romanticize and not to vilify. And the cameras followed as the Harrow Foundation announced a small pilot program for local maintenance staff. At the launch, Evelyn spoke in a hall that smelled of coffee and polished wood. "This began as a simple gratitude," she told the crowd, "and became an opportunity to invest in people who keep our communities moving." Jason stood to the side, hands folded, Mia at his elbow with a ribbon in her hair, Rosa handing out cookies. Mayor Daniels read a municipal proclamation, Miguel Santos clapped as if he could clap the world into place, and Officer Torres nodded with private satisfaction. The speech was part public relations and part genuine conviction. People reacted in a mix of admiration and skepticism. Some accused the Harrows of buying goodwill. Others saw a precedent of corporate responsibility. Lewis told anyone who would listen that Jason had always been the kind of man who did the right thing. The day swelled with images of a handshake and then with quieter scenes of paperwork signed and a small fund set aside for staff schooling. There was an awkwardness to celebrity, the hollow brightness of flashes catching on a simple shirt cuff. Later that night, in the bakery's back room, Rosa pressed a piece of paper into Jason's hand. It was a note from a neighbor, a string of names promising to watch Mia when necessary and to bring soup when he worked late. The community had a way of returning favors in the smallest, truest ways. we must acknowledge the moments of real tension that threaded the whole story. The first came the night the offer was first whispered in an office over coffee, where Elena, the secretary, misdialed and Jason's name was broadcast on a conference line. He imagined his privacy dissolving. He sat on his bed with Mia asleep and the ceiling leaking, the uncertainty like cold water seeping in. The second arrived when a local blogger suggested that the Harrows were exploiting a viral moment. Secure labor for cheap, and Jason saw headlines that called him grateful, and grateful only for the price of his silence. He spent an afternoon at the town library rubbing his thumbs over the paper as if he could smooth the words away. The third wound tight during a family dinner the week before his move when Miguel Santos warned him about leaving steady work for the unknown, and Mia asked if she would have to leave her best friend. Each of these moments tightened his chest and opened him to doubt. He tested the contract clauses twice, consulted Rosa and Officer Torres, and finally asked Evelyn to add a clause about schooling and housing safeguard. She agreed without protest, and that simple act of listening changed the tenor of all three tensions from fear into negotiated safety. 1 month later, the adjustment was small and concrete. Jason had packed a single worn suitcase, the toolbox with stickers that Mia had decorated, and the framed photo of her first-grade graduation. The Harrow maintenance unit provided a modest 2-bedroom staff flat near the stables and a community room where people hung flyers for lost pets and piano lessons. Mia found a new school with a counselor named Anna who specialized in transitions and who texted Jason regular updates. Rosa Alvarez sent a care package of pastries and a handmade broom. Luis offered to keep a spare key, and Miguel Santos called to say he'd vouch for Jason's work ethic on any future application. The salary was steady, health insurance made visits to the dentist possible for the first time in years, and the scholarship fund had already paid for Mia's new backpack and a winter coat. There was still the awkwardness of being the subject of local articles and the unexpected generosity of neighbors who stopped by with casseroles. But there was also a tiny yard where Mia could hang a line for her socks and a quiet night where Jason slept through to dawn without the tug of an unpaid bill in his mind. At 3 months, the ripple had grown. Jason's hands, once exclusively used to fix the sudden and the broken, were learning scheduled maintenance and preventative care. He taught a weekend class at the community center on basic car safety and tools, and the class filled with people who could not afford professional help. Sarah Green wrote a follow-up that focused less on spectacle and more on systems, a profile that showed how the Harrow Fund had seeded a program to train local technicians. Mayor Daniels announced a small grant inspired by the partnership, and Rosa's Bakery provided coffee for the training mornings. Mia, who had at first been shy, found a place on the school's reading team and called home to describe a library book that had caught her imagination. Tom Harrow visited the town hall and met with other community leaders to discuss replicating a staff program. Support model. Evelyn and Jason met less often but with greater ease, and their conversations slid from the transactional into the human. "You're good with people," she told him once, watching him explain a concept to a trainee. He shrugged with the ease of a man who had been practicing that truth his whole life. 6 months in, the change felt durable. The maintenance program had 2 paid apprentices from the town, a small fund for emergency family needs, and a partnership with the vocational school. Miguel Santos now visited the Harrow property to consult on workflow and returned with ideas to improve schedules at the local depot. Officer Torres organized a safety campaign and named Jason as a community ambassador in recognition of his role in launching the training. The house over Rosa's Bakery still felt like a second home because the ties there were not transactional. Evelyn had started a small board to oversee the employee fund, and she invited Rosa and Miguel as community members. Mia had a scholarship book fund in her name at the school library, started by neighbors who wanted to ensure other kids would not have to leave their friends for lack of resources. Jason found that mornings were less about worry and more about small plans. Building a shelf for Mia's books, fixing a broken fence post, teaching a young apprentice to test a battery with patience. The town had not been transformed in a single breath, but the arc of possibility was longer now. People who had once muttered about privilege now nodded when they passed Jason at the hardware store, not because money had changed him, but because support had made space for him to continue being himself. Back in his apartment, the symbol of that night remained simple: a stained white baseball cap with a little oil mark at the rim that Mia refused to part with. It was a reminder that the act itself had been ordinary and radical at once. On a Sunday when Evelyn visited the town fair, she watched as Jason set up a kid's safety booth and taught little hands to tie a knot. She walked over with a small paper cup of lemonade and said softly, "You did not have to accept what we offered." He took the cup and smiled tiredly. "I did not accept charity," he said. "I accepted an opportunity. That is different." She nodded. "Thank you for trusting us," she said. He looked at his daughter threading beads up a next table and felt the full weight of a decision that had been made not for spectacle, but for keeping a promise to a child. The cameras eventually left, and the local headlines softened into a column about partnerships that worked. Rosa hung a photo of the community launch on the bakery's wall next to the receipt that had first been folded in Evelyn's glove compartment. It was small proof that stories had continuity, and that kindness could be formalized without losing its heart. If this story resonates, subscribe to follow more accounts of ordinary people whose choices ripple out. We tell these stories to remember that integrity matters in both small acts and big deals. There will be more updates from this town and others where neighbors decide to act with courage. In the end, Jason kept the cap, Mia kept the ribbon, and a simple repair under a sycamore planted a seed that fed a neighborhood. Sometimes a stop to help a stranger is only the beginning. Sometimes a small kindness becomes the ground for something steady and real. If you believe kindness can change a life, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment with the word that best captures how you feel right now. Sometimes compassion saves one life. Often it opens the doors for many more.